on the right of this current box would get pushed out of the way. Now you've seen that we can specify these values as a height of 300 pixels and a width of 300 pixels to begin with. Now if I change the height to 600 pixels, then that div will expand vertically, pushing down any other divs or any other content that's not inside this current container. Now I can also do the same with the width and make it much wider so that anything that used to be on the right of this current box would get pushed out of the way. Now you've seen that we can specify these values either as static pixels, so for example here, or we can use percentages. For example, I can say that the width should be 100%, and that refers to 100% of the viewport. Now, the viewport is just the screen that you're viewing the website on. So that could be your laptop screen or your mobile screen or your iPad screen, but this will expand to 100% of whatever that screen size may be. Now, here's where it gets interesting. In addition to the width and the height of an element, you can also specify that it should have a border or not. Now, if you say that the border is going to be a solid border using CSS, then you will see a default 3-pixel border show up around your element. Now, remember that this border doesn't encroach on the size of your element. So if it's 300 pixels by 300 pixels, that blue area is still going to be 300 by 300. But you can expand the border size to say that the border width should be 50 pixels all round. So that's 50 pixels on every single side. So now the width of this entire element is actually much wider because in addition to 300 pixels width for the original element, so that's the blue part, we've now also got a 50 pixel border on each side. And the entire thing now takes up 400 pixels. Now, instead of specifying a border width for all 4 sides, you can override that border by saying specifically that the border top should only have 0 pixels. Alternatively, you can use the circle shorthand. So it means that we're going around in a circle starting from the top. So the border width starting at the top is going to have 0 pixels at the top, 10 pixels at the right, 20 pixels on the bottom, and 30 pixels on the left. And as you go clockwise, you give your element dimensions that you specify for all 4 sides. And there's other variations around this theme as well, which you'll find in the documentation. Now, let's take this one step further. Let's say that we had some content in our div or in our box. Now, let's say that we had some text, for example. The first thing that we remember is that even if our div or our box had no height and no width, it will have the height and width in order to fit our content. Now, let's say that we didn't like the way that this looked. We want to have a little bit of padding or a little bit of space between the text and the edge of the element or where the border starts. Well, then we can actually specify some padding. And this says that there should be 20 pixels of space on all 4 edges between the text and the edge of the element. So now our box is even bigger. The padding actually increases the size of your box. Now, the final dimension that we can add is the margin. And the margin is a buffer zone, if you will, between the current element and any others that are on screen. So, we have text on 4 sides. The first thing that we remember is that even if our div or our box had no height and no width, it will have the height and width in order to fit our content. Now, let's say that we didn't like the way that this looked. We want to have a little bit of padding or a little bit of space between the text and the edge of the element or where the border starts. Well, then we can actually specify some padding. And this says that there should be 20 and bigger margin. Border are just boxes. Effect on an HTML element. And so, for example, if I select no border, no padding, but it has, then you can see that that's one element also at top C it easy, and that allows you to quite easily visualize what each of these things are doing. So for example, I could double my content and it adds those rules. It also just adds much of our element. Now, that's not true for all of these different things. For example, let's add a 20 pixel margin all around our div. Now, the parts that have the background color represents our element, and the margin just takes it away from all the other things around. So in this case, we don't actually have much else around. We've only got the top, the left, and the right of the screen to push it away from. But say if we go back into Atom, and as a challenge, I want you to add 2 more divs below this one. And I want you to give each of these 3 divs a class. So the first one should be the top container, the second one will be called the middle container, and the last one will be called the bottom container. And each of these 2 divs should be a square that has a height of 200 pixels and a width of 200 pixels, and give them each a different background color so that we can differentiate them on our website. And this is what you'll end up with if you complete the challenge. A red and blue div that are sitting on top of each other, and they are 200 pixels wide in width and in height. So pause the video and try to complete the challenge. All right, so pause the video. And try to complete the challenge. All right, so how did that go? Well, just below our first div, we're going to go ahead and create 2 more of them. So that's the middle one, and this is the bottom one. We're going to change the class to give it a value so that we can differentiate between them. Now, in this case, feel free to use ID or class, because if we're only going to have 1 top container, 1 middle, and 1 bottom container, we can actually give this an ID or a class. It doesn't really matter all that much in this case. So if we call the top one top container, middle one middle container, and the bottom one bottom container, now we have 3 different divs, and we can now style them inside our CSS separately. So instead of styling all the divs, we're going to instead select the top container. And remember, in order to pick out a class, we have to add a dot in front of that identifier. So for the top container class, and then I'm just going to paste in that background color. Next one is the middle container. And this one is going to have a background color of red. And the final one is the bottom container. And this one's background color will be blue, shall we? Hit save. And as we said, these 2 containers, because they don't have any content, then that means they won't have any dimensions unless we give it to them. So let's say that the middle container should have a width of 200 pixels wide and a height of 200 pixels as well. So now it's a box, and I'm just going to copy and paste that over to the bottom container as well. Now if we hit save and we take a look, let's get rid of this, hit refresh, then you can see that we've got our top div over here, a red square and a blue square, all showing up on screen. Now, if we right click and pull up the Chrome Developer Tools once more, then you can see that we can play around with all of these properties only using the Chrome Developer Tools. So for example, if I select my top container and I change the height to say 200 pixels, making it a little bit bigger, and change its width also to 200 pixels, making it look a bit more like the other 2 squares. I can also add a bit of padding. So let's give it 20 pixels of padding around all 4 edges. And you can see that this hasn't changed the height or width. The height and width are still 200 by 200, but now it has 20 pixels of padding all around it, making the entire element that has that background color look a lot bigger than what it used to be, because we've just added 40 pixels to the width and the height. Now, what if we add a 10 pixel solid border? Then you can see that that border hasn't affected the size of the part that has a blue background color, but it has made this whole element even larger. And now our height is 200 plus 30 pixels each side. So it's actually 260 pixels height and 260 pixels wide. Now, what if I add a little bit of margin to this? Let's say we have a 10 pixel margin around all four sides. Now, the margin doesn't affect the height or the width or any of the other previous values. And it doesn't even change the part of the element that has the background color. It just gives it a little bit of space away from the other elements, and it pushes them away so that they're not sticking to this current container or this current div. Now, here's a website where you can actually see that box model as it turns to the side. And it shows you which parts are the padding, which parts will get filled with the background image, which parts will end up with the background color, and which parts the content would go. So this is a neat tool to just toggle around and just wrap your head around this idea of the box model, because it is a little bit weird that when you have padding, it only pads the content, but not things like the background image or the background color. So I've included a link to this website inside the resources of this lesson, and you can go here and just have a play around and get to grips with this idea. Now, once you've done that, I've got a challenge for you. I want you to use the Chrome developer tools. So don't edit the styles inside Atom, but instead just make temporary changes to the website so that you can change the margins, the borders, the paddings. Now, the only thing that's not going to change is the height and width of these divs or these boxes. But I want you to create a design that looks like this. So you're going to have that first box right towards the edge of the top and the left of the web page. Then you're going to have the two other boxes that touch corner to corner. And this second one is going to have a 20 pixel border. And the third one is going to have a 10 pixel border. And you can change the color to match this scheme as well. But the main thing is that the corners must touch each other. And I want you to use a combination of margins, padding, border, whatever it may be in order to achieve this design. So pause the video now and give it a go. All right, so what you might realize is that this involves a little bit of maths. So firstly, I'm going to switch my Chrome browser tool to make it go on the right side so I can look at this while I'm editing my CSS code and look at the box at the same time. So the first thing was that we wanted the top div to also be 200 pixels by 200 pixels. There we go, we've got our square. So we now have 3 squares, but we need the first one to have a 10 pixel border. So border, solid, and let's give it 20 pixels of padding around all 4 edges. All right, so on to the next part. Our middle box is red and it has a 20 pixel solid border. So let's go ahead and select the middle container, and we're going to give it a border that is going to be solid and 20 pixels all around. But now we have to make this second box touch with the first box edge to edge. So this actually involves a little bit of calculating. So if we go back to that first box, we can see that its width is calculated by all of these numbers. So it's 200 pixels in terms of the content, then 20 pixels either side. So add 40 for the padding, then add another 20 for the border, and the margin is 0. So that's actually 200 plus 40 plus 20, which is 260. So that means that if our second div had a left margin of 260 pixels, then it will touch edge to edge with that first box. So if this challenge has baffled you up till now, then Pause the video now that you've seen this little hint and try to do the same thing for the last box, making sure that you've implemented exactly what we wanted for the dimensions and the layout. But if you want to follow along with me, that's also cool. So first things first, this one is yellow, ours is blue, doesn't really matter, but we can change it over. So we're going to select our last div and we're going to change the background color to yellow or gold or whichever color you want. And then we're going to give it a border of 10 pixels solid. So we're going to say border solid 10 pixels all around. And now we have to calculate how far we need to push this square in order to make it touch corner to corner with this red box. So we remember that this was 260 pixels wide, calculating adding all of these border padding and width together. And this one has a content of 200 pixels wide. It has no padding, but it has a 20 pixel border left and right. So in total, that's 240 in width. So 240 plus 260 is 500. So if we select our last div and we give it a margin left, so we can either type it out or we can select it inside the box model. But if we make this one 500 pixels margin left, then you'll see that the corners now all touch each other and we have exactly the same design as we've got over here. Now, how did that go? If that was confusing at all, then make sure you play around more with the Chrome developer tools, either through changing everything in the box model here, or by adding in new style rules through the CSS inside Chrome developer tools. But make sure that you can get these things to be pushed left and right and top and bottom and make it look the way that you want it to. Now, if you want the boxes to line up one after the other on the same horizontal plane, then that's a little bit more difficult, and we're going to come to that very, very shortly. So don't beat yourself up if you can't do that, but you should be able to move it top and bottom and add the padding, add the borders, and make the content look the way you want it to. But once you're done, hit refresh and all of that work goes away, but we're back to where we are and we can continue beautifying our website and giving it a proper modern design. Now, in the next lesson, we're going to talk about the CSS display property so that we can start to understand how the positioning of elements work on screen. So for all of that and more, I'll see you on the next lesson. All right, so our website is still looking a little bit sparse, and in fact, it's looking nothing like this, is it? But we're going to change that very, very quickly. Let's go ahead and add the rest of the content in order to have all the images that we need for our top section. Now, in this lesson, if you look at the resources, you'll find a zip file that you can download. And once you extract that zip file, you should now have a folder called CSS My Site Images. Now, if you double click on this, you should find for our top section. Now, in this lesson, if you look at the resources, you'll find a zip file that you can download. And once you extract that zip file, you should now have a folder called CSS My Site Images. Now, if you double click on this folder, you'll see two images. One is a cloud and another is a mountain. And we're going to try and CSS My Site. And once you extract the resources, you'll find a zip file that you can download. And once you extract that zip file, you should now have a folder called CSS My Site create images. Now, if you double click on this folder, you'll see two images. One is a cloud and another is a mountain. And we're going to try and recreate the scene that they've got over here. So let's go ahead and add those images to our project folder. So if you pull up Atom and find your project folder, then we're going to go and create a new folder in here called Images. And inside this images folder is where we're going to drag and drop those two PNGs, the cloud and the mountain. So we're going to put it inside here so that we can use it inside our website. So now we're going to go ahead and add our images so that we have a image of a cloud at the top of our top container. So the source will be images/cloud.png, and the alt text will just be cloud image. And we're going to have another cloud below this paragraph tag. And finally, we're going to have an image out we can use it inside our website. So now we're going to go ahead and add our images so that we have a image of a cloud at the top of our top container. So the source will be images/cloud.png, and the alt text will just be cloud image. And we're going to have another cloud below this paragraph tag. And finally, we're going to have an image of our mountain right at the bottom. So that will be images/mountain.png, and the alt text will just be mountain image. All right, let's hit save and let's refresh to see what our page looks like right now. Now, it looks a little bit weird, right? Why is it that this cloud is taking up its own line and it's not next to either this heading or this paragraph tag, but this cloud is on the same line and next to this mountain image? What is going on here? Well, to understand this, we have to look at the CSS display property. Now, the display property has 4 different values, and we're going to look at them in turn and see what each one of these does. Now, if we switch on pesticide again, you can see that the box around the cloud is only as large as the image, as is the box around the mountain and this cloud. But the box around the H1 and also the paragraph element, they're as long as the width of the page. So what's going on here? Well, by default, some elements are what's called block display. For example, this H1 and this paragraph tag. And block elements are those that take up essentially the whole width of the screen on a web page. So effectively blocking out any other elements from sitting next to it on the left or on the right. Now, the most common block elements that we would have seen already are our paragraphs, our headers, so H1 through to H6, our divs, our lists and list items, as well as forms. And if we head over to CodePen, and I'm just going to create a new anonymous pen. Let me just get rid of the JS editor, and I'm going to have my view with my editors on the right. So now I'm going to go ahead and create 2 block elements. So we know that paragraphs are block elements. So let's create a paragraph called hello, another one called world. Now, if I select the paragraph tag in my CSS and I give them both a background, I'm going to not so and also the paragraph element, they're as long as the width of the page. So what's going on here? Well, by default, some elements are what's called block display. For example, this H1 and this paragraph tag. And block elements are those that take up essentially the whole width of the screen on a web page. So effectively blocking out any other elements from sitting next to it on the left or on the right. Now, the most common block elements that we would have seen already are our paragraphs, our headers, so H1 through to H6, our divs, our lists and list items, as well as forms. And if we head over to CodePen, and I'm just going to create a new anonymous pen. Let me just get rid of the JS editor. And I'm going to have my view with my editors on the right. So now I'm going to go ahead and create two block elements. So we know that paragraphs are block elements. So let's create a paragraph called hello, another one called world. Now, if I select the paragraph tag in my CSS and I give them both a background color of, say, red, then you can see that the entire paragraph takes up the whole width of the web page. So it's blocking any other element from being on the same line next to it on the right or on the left. Now, here's a related problem. Say if I wanted to look at this paragraph tag, which we now know to be a block element. What if I wanted to style the pro part of it differently from the rest of the words in this paragraph tag? How can I only target one part of this paragraph tag? How can I say, for example, underline the word pro so that it says a programmer, but style these three characters differently? Well, some of you might think that I could just split up this sentence into three paragraph tags. So what if it was a plus a space, then it was pro, and then it was grammar. A programmer. So now I've got this separate paragraph tag for the word pro, and I can give it a class of, say, just the word pro, and I can go into styles and style it differently from the others. So I can say .pro, and this one, if you do a little bit of research on Google, you'll find that in order to make it underlined, you just have to change the text decoration to underline. Now, what happens in this case? Let's check it out. You can see that because the paragraph element are blocking elements, they take up the entire width and they block everything else from being on the same line as themselves. This doesn't actually work. Even though we've been able to target just one part of that line, we can't have it looking like this. So let me show you the solution. Instead of having three paragraph tags, so let's just undo this to where we were before. We've got a single paragraph element. What we can do is we can use another HTML element called a span. And inside the span, we can add that word pro, and we can give that span a class of pro. And because we've already selected that class in CSS and we're making that part underlined, then that is going to be applied to the word in this span. Now, if we hit save and we refresh, you can see that we've achieved what we set out to do. And this sentence is still on the same line. Now, why is that? If we switch on pesticide once more, and I hold down the control key, you can see that over here, I'm hovering over the entire paragraph element. But one part of it has a span, and this allows us to select, almost like as if you would highlight a section of your text. Just select one part of the text in order to format it or style it differently. Now, the reason why I'm showing you this here instead of inside the HTML module is because spans like divs don't do very much unless they're used in conjunction with CSS. But another reason why I'm showing it to you now is because the span element is what's known as an inline display element. So unlike block display elements, for example, the heading and also the paragraph element, a inline display element only takes up as much space as it needs to in the height and in its width. So you can see that the box around the span is only as large as it needs to be, as is the box around our cloud and also our mountain. So some of the common inline elements that you're going to come across are things like spans, image elements, and also your anchor tags. If you think back to our CV website that we created in our HTML module, The links for our hobbies website and our contact me website, they show up next to each other. And this is because they are inline elements and they do not block other elements from occurring elements. It's part of the reason why but another own layer it needs its own and are things function. So some of the common inline elements that you're going to come across are things like spans, image elements, and also your anchor tags. If you think back to our CV website that we created in our HTML module, the links for our hobbies website and our contact me website, they show up next to each other. And this is because they are inline elements and they do not block other elements from occurring on the same line. In fact, they encourage them to. And so this is why they're called inline elements. Now, if we head back into our code pen and we create another span. Now, while you can have spans that are nested inside paragraph tags or H1s or whatever else it may be, you can also have them as standalones. But you can see here, if we select our span element and we also give it a background color, then you can see that these elements are in line. And even if we had a whole bunch more of these spans, they would continue to be stacked onto the same line until we run out of space. Horizontally. Now, you might wonder, why would we ever use block elements if we can simply use inline elements? Surely it seems far more flexible. Well, there's just one problem. With inline elements, you can't actually change the width. So if I said the width of all the spans should be 100 pixels, you can see that absolutely nothing happens. But if I specify a width, the same width, to our block elements, then you can see that it complies very eagerly. But it still doesn't let any other element sit on the same line. So what can you do? Well, you can actually change the display property of any given element. So I can make a paragraph element, which we know is by default a block element. I can change its display value to inline. And that makes all of our paragraphs inline elements and allows everything to sit next to each other on the same line. But you can see we've just lost the ability to change its width. Now, similarly, I can change the display property of our inline elements to block elements. And this allows me to change its width, but it doesn't let them sit on the same line. So what should I do if I wanted elements that can occupy the same line, but at the same time I can set their widths? Which one should I choose then? Well, you don't actually have to choose, because there is another type of display, which is called the inline block. And this kind of gives you the best of both worlds. So if instead of changing the paragraph element to inline, I'm going to change it to inline dash block, then you'll see that not only am I allowed to change its width, you can see that it's now 100 pixels wide, but I'm also able to make them go onto the same line. So act almost like inline elements. And this is kind of what image elements are like by default. Now, I say kind of because, as always, reality is much more complex than that. But if you're interested, I'll provide a link to more discussion around this. But for our purposes, we're just going to treat images as if they are inline block elements, because we're able to change its width and height to whatever it is that we desire, and they also get displayed as if they're inline elements next to each other. So we've now covered 3 out of the 4 display values that we have access to. The last one is simply display none, and that just gets rid of our element. So let's head back into our code And that just gets rid of our element. So let's head back into our code pen, and I'm going to give our second paragraph element a separate class. I'm going to call this second P, and I'm going to target it down here, dot second P, and I'm going to set its display value to none. And you can see what that does is that it simply removes that element from the website as if it didn't exist. So if I get rid of this display block and allow our spans to continue being inline elements, you can see that there's no gap between the first hello and the second hello. That world paragraph has now completely disappeared out of the flow of the document as if it never was written inside the code. It's almost like I've just gone ahead and deleted it from the HTML. But of course I haven't. And all that I've done is just set its display value to none. Now, when you're trying to figure out how to hide things on your web page, for example, if you had a quiz, then you might want to hide and show the answer. There's two ways that you can do this. One is display none, as you've seen here, which takes that element out of the flow and it's as if it never existed. The other one is a property called visibility. And this you can set to hidden. And what this does is that it makes that element disappear, but it keeps its original position and all the other elements still flow around it as if it's still there. It just can't be seen anymore. So whenever you're trying to make things disappear or reappear, think about what effect you want to have and choose between these two properties. So as we've seen in this lesson, the position of elements on screen are determined by many things. The box model, the margins, the size of the border, the size of the width and the height of the actual element, whether if it's display block or whether if it's display inline, whether if we're allowed to set its width or if we're not. But even before CSS comes into play, you have to remember that there's already rules that govern how your HTML elements should be displayed on screen. So to learn about that and to learn more about CSS positioning, I'll see you on the next lesson. Now, in the last lesson, we looked at how we could change the display property using CSS in order to change the way that our elements stacked against each other. Now, in this lesson, we're going to explore CSS positioning in more detail. But before we do so, the first thing we have to realize is that even without CSS, your HTML elements already has predefined rules for how it should be displayed on your web page, even if you don't have any CSS. And we have to understand how things get positioned by default before we can go on to change it, to bend it to our will without getting confused and getting stuck. So let's take a look at these rules. So let's go through those rules quickly. The first rule is that content is everything. Now we know that inline elements only take up as much width and as much height as the content. So if you have a span that contains a long word, then it has a large width. If you have a span that contains a short word, then it has a short width. And with block elements, even though they take up 100% of the width, the height is still determined by the content. So if you have a really super large font for your H1 or for your paragraph, then that box model is going to take up a lot more height than if it was a smaller font. So your content is the first thing that determines how large things get